Are you looking to get into real estate photography but you don't know what settings to use or even where to begin? Well, I'm going to share with you my settings that I use. I'm going to share with you what camera I use and what gear I used, and some tips I do to actually get the job done. G'day friends, when I started in real estate photography 8 or 9 years ago, I had no idea what I was doing. I watched a bunch of videos and learned about 6 different ways you could shoot a room for real estate. But over time and many thousands of houses, I've streamlined it to a point where I don't need as much gear, which means it's less costly to get into this business, and it's also much easier to get the job done now than it was, say, 5 years ago. Okay, the first thing we should talk about is the absolute minimum gear you need to get started in this business. And the quickest way to get great results is by doing HDR photography. Most of the real estate industry is already using this style anyway. I prefer flambient style, which is a mixture of flash and ambient lighting, but doing it that way uses more gear and also it isn't fast enough. Whereas when you're shooting HDR, you're blending 5 images together, so you're getting images light exposure through dark exposure, and that captures the whole range of that image. It captures all the shadows and all the highlights in 5 images. And then you blend those images together in a program called Lightroom or Photoshop, and you get one perfectly exposed image, theoretically. So the camera you're going to need to start off with is going to have to be a full frame camera. So whichever suits your budget, find a full frame camera in Nikon, Sony, Canon, or whatever. Find one that fits your budget and buy that full frame camera. You can get away with a lesser camera or a crop sensor camera, but you find the image quality isn't quite there because the sensor isn't quite good enough. And you have to keep in mind that a lot of these images are blown up and put in front of advertising boards on houses and so on. Sometimes they're on billboards, so you need to make sure that you're tack sharp and you have got a good lens and a good camera. Personally, I use Canon, but that's just because I like Canon. I've been using Canon for years. I've always liked Canon cameras, so that's what I use. That doesn't mean you should go and buy a Canon. You just buy whatever fits your budget in a full frame camera. The next thing you need is a wide angle zoom lens. Don't just buy a fixed wide lens because you do need that zoom every now and then. You've got to zoom in on things occasionally, so you're going to need to have that zoom capability. But the top end of the lens, the zooming in part, isn't really that important compared to the lower end. So if you don't know lenses, how it works is this. If you have a 15mm to 30mm lens, the 15mm is at its widest, which means you can see more of the surroundings and so on. So it's a bigger picture. But if you're up at the 30mm end, it's more like a zoomed in thing. So for instance, right now I'm shooting with a wide angle lens, but if I zoom it in, this is what you get. Whereas I can zoom out, you can see my studio a bit more, but this is what you'll get if I zoom out. So when that was zoomed out, that was at 15mm. Now how wide a lens do you need? Well, you need a lens that is 16mm or less, so your number has to be below 16. I did shoot real estate for many years with a 17 to 40 lens, and 17 was just not quite wide enough. I was always asked to, can you shoot a bit wider? Can you shoot a bit wider? I'd have to push out of doorways and hide in corners and squish myself in corners. It made my job very difficult. But I've since moved to a 15 to 30, and that's made a huge difference. So just find a 16mm or below wide angle lens that you can use, and that will get you by. Doesn't matter what brand, doesn't matter how cheap it is, as long as you've got a full frame camera and a wide angle lens, you'll be okay. So the other thing you're going to need is you're also going to need one flash, just one. And this one is a Yongnuo 560 version 3. And it is literally the third of a price of a Canon flash or a Nikon flash, or Nikon, whichever way you want to say it. When I started in real estate 8 years ago, I was shooting a different style. I had multiple light stands, multiple flashes, so I could push light wherever I wanted to push it. So I had 7 flashes and 7 stands and 1 camera. I had a remote trigger for all the flashes, and you could control the whole lot from the camera. It was pretty cool. And between you and me, I miss shooting that way, but it's too slow and it isn't required now. And the real estate industry has sped up. Agents won't wait around for you to set all that rubbish up anymore. So as I said, I bought 7 of these, and my plan was that I'll buy Yongnuo flashes to start, and once I start earning money and doing well in real estate and getting a bit better in real estate, I'll buy Canon flashes when these ones break. This flash that you're seeing right now is literally one of the first 7 flashes that I bought. It's also the last one, so over that 8 years, 7 other flashes have died over time. I've dropped a couple, some have just died, and so on. But when this one dies, or I drop this one, I will literally go out and buy another Yongnuo flash, but I'm going to buy the version 4 instead of the version 3 because that's the newest one, and they're a grand total of $85. So one of the last 2 things you're going to need now is a tripod. I use a carbon fiber Manfrotto tripod, but there is an aluminium version of this, or aluminum if you're American, which is very good, but it doesn't really matter what tripod you get, as long as you get one that goes 1.4 meters high, at least. Depending on your height, that will roughly be your height of your eye. Or if you're watching this in the US, 55 inches. It's got to be higher than that. You will also need a pistol grip ball head as well, like this one. This one is a Manfrotto 222. They don't make these anymore. I've had this one forever. which is probably why they don't make them anymore, because they don't break, therefore they can't sell more of them. But there are still plenty of these around. You can get second hand, so if you can get one of these, they're the best there is. Grab one of these because they're amazing. Otherwise, there's plenty of other pistol grip ball heads. Otherwise, there's plenty of other pistol head grip ball things. I can't say pistol head grip ball. Otherwise, there's plenty of other pistol grip heads you can get for your camera. Just buy whatever you need to fit your budget. Now go out and buy all that gear and then come back and watch this video. I'll wait.
5 minutes later.
Oh, great. Now you have all the gear. Let's talk about the heights of tripod settings when you're actually shooting. You need to know what height to have your tripod at. Everybody makes this mistake, so I thought I would show you exactly what heights I shoot at to get that consistent quality over and over again. So when you're shooting bedrooms and living areas and things like that, the camera should be no higher than your belly button. When you shoot down a little bit lower, you get more of the end of the bed in. You're not cutting the bed off, so it makes the room look bigger than it is. And in living areas, you want to maintain that same height. Now the belly button is just a starting point. Depends on how tall you are, but that's where I'd start. And the next thing you don't do is you don't point your camera downwards or upwards, you point your camera straight. So all your vertical lines are perfectly vertical. You want them perfectly straight. We don't want to have them like this, we don't want them like that. Every time I see a real estate shoot that has angled lines like that, where the verticals aren't straight, I just think, not done by a professional. Or it's done by a beginner, one or the other. So you want to come across as professional straight away, because you're trying to get work, you don't want to come across as a beginner. And when you're shooting bathrooms and kitchen benches and kitchen tables, you bring the camera height up to your sternum height, which is right there in the middle of your chest. That's the height you want to be at. It's where you want your camera to be. And once again, make sure your camera verticals are dead straight. Don't shoot downwards towards the table, don't shoot up towards the ceiling. You shoot straight. And when you go outside, you want to make sure that your camera height is at your eye level. So if you have a tripod that goes up 1.4 meters, you'll probably find with the ball grip and the camera on top, it'll probably be at your direct height of your eye. Keep in mind, I'm 6 feet 1 inches tall, so if you are 7 feet 6 inches or you're 3 foot 4, then you're going to have to adjust your settings accordingly. Now for the camera settings, which is what I know you've all been waiting for, but you can't really shoot unless you know the other stuff first, which is why I'm telling you about the camera settings now. For indoor shooting, I have my ISO set at 320 and my aperture or f-stop is set at f8. When shooting at f8 with a wide angle lens, everything in that shot should be in focus. And you also will get a decent amount of light in through the lens as well. Now I also have a flash on top of the camera, that's the Yongnuo one I talked about before, and that is set at 1/16th power as well, and that's pointed up at the ceiling slightly forwards. So when you fire off your flash, the light will go up to the ceiling, hit the ceiling, diffuse, and come down in a blanket in front of the camera. And that will light anything in the foreground, so if you've got dark shadows in the foreground, that'll fix it. What it also does is it fixes the light in the room. If it's a very yellow light or a very dimly lit room, it'll fix that for you as well. It'll make your white balance look a little bit more accurate, and of course it will light things in the foreground, as I said. If you're in a house that has nice furniture and perfect downlights and they're all white lights and everything's brightly lit, you don't even need to use your flash. Now for white balance settings, I set that to auto and I hardly ever change it. I also have my camera set to 5 bracketed images, and this is called exposure bracketing. And what it does is when you press that button once, it'll shoot a middle exposure, and it'll shoot 2 images that are underexposed and 2 images that are overexposed, so you end up with 5 images light through dark. So when they're underexposed, that'll bring the detail in the windows, and when they're overexposed, that'll bring the shadows up that are in the room as well. And when you blend them all together in Lightroom, you get a perfectly exposed image because you have the full spectrum of light through dark, all blended together. How much light you let into the lens is controlled by your shutter speed. You leave your f-stop and you leave your ISO alone, and you just adjust it by shutter speed. And how I usually do that is I'll overexpose to a window like this a little bit. Some of the highlights are blown out, some of the shadows are a bit dark. I sort of pick the middle, and then I fire off my shot, and then I check. And as long as you've got all your shadows covered and all your highlights covered when you look at your images, you can move on to the next shot. If you haven't, you just adjust it slightly. If you realize you haven't got your highlights, you bring them down a little bit. You realize you haven't got your shadows, you bring it up a little bit, and so on. And it's just done by spinning that dial on top of your camera, that shutter speed on top of your camera. When shooting outdoors, the only difference I make is I change my ISO to 100 because I'm not going to use a flash outdoors anyway, and I shoot it exactly the same way. And then I'll fire off the 5 images and see whether I caught all the shadows and caught all the highlights. And if I did, I just move on. So as you can see, once you get the hang of this, you can move through a house very, very quickly. If I'm doing a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, double-story house for instance, and I'm doing it at dusk and there's no sun pumping in the windows, so we've just got evenly lit house, I can get through that whole house, photos inside, in about 15 minutes. And that's just because I've done so many houses. You know the angles after a while, so you just start going to the correct spot and fire off your shot. Quite often I'll get it first try and move on to the next one. Once you've mastered this photography part, you can move into other areas like floor plans and drone and video and so on. I've done a video right here explaining what gear you'll need to get started in that. Thanks for watching.